So I think we are live, and we want to welcome you all to our bonus edition of the 2020 TAC meeting. Happy 2021 as well. We've got a nice and full agenda here. People are joining us as we speak, popping on exactly at the hour here. But I want to welcome you all. This virtual world is getting better and better. I suppose you're all doing the same thing I am, but I have now a screen full of faces, which is really terrific. But welcome one and all. We do have a full agenda. It's, even though this is a bonus round and much of the material has been presented, the goal of this session is to afford the opportunity to have greater amount of discussion. Last session in December was really a forced march to get through the agenda. We did, we accomplished that goal, but several people mentioned that they felt unfulfilled, that we hadn't had an adequate amount of time to discuss some of the topics. Even beyond that, and this is failure on my part, we failed to vote on the actionable recommendations, so they are as yet not fully vetted in terms of having a vote, and therefore not official yet. The second item for us and for our consideration today, per the email that I sent out earlier in the week, is to look at the Artificial Intelligence Working Group white paper. This is an extensive white paper and a major contribution, biasing the jury, if you will. But I was really impressed with the good work that had been done, bringing together all of the work that had been accomplished through the year, but doing it in a very thoughtful and professional way. So do appreciate that work, but we will have an opportunity to discuss that. And because we're discussing the white paper, Lisa and Adam will be given a little extra time to cover that topic. I do know that it came in its full form relatively late in the cycle, but then again, often that is the case, that we have a limited amount of time to review. Because of that, we'll give some flexibility to do minor edits from here on out, but it is a really powerful, really strong paper, and so look forward to that discussion. Third topic for the day is to talk about next year, which is really this year, next year in the TAC vernacular, but 2021 work items. As we have a change in administration within the FCC as well as within the federal government, we'll see changes there, and I'm sure we'll have guidance on what the incoming chair wants us to be focused on, but we always provide our own recommendations, and the time today gives us a little bit more time to talk about those, and different ones have actually submitted their ideas in advance of the meeting. We'll have a little time to discuss those as we go through. In line with that transition, there's not a great deal that can be said, but we will look forward to any guidance and any insights that the FCC team can provide, and that'll come up very shortly. And then finally, there are a set of household and administrative items on the longer term, not just in the meeting sense, that we'll go through. Since this is a transition year, our 2-year FACA time cycle does time out in May, so we'll need to re-up, and we'll talk about some of the details there. So that's the path that we're on. Let me quickly move to allow others to fill in some of those gaps. But let me turn things over to Ron Rapazzi to go ahead and give his opening comments. And it's amazing, the FCC is donned with coats and ties and formalities that are unfamiliar to most of the rest of us at this point in our cycle. But Ron, you look very dapper. Take it away.
Thank you for the kind compliment, Dennis. And we're trying to keep up our image, that's for sure. But thank you and good morning to everyone. Good early morning to some of you on the West Coast and other parts of the world, perhaps even. Dennis, you made a remark about failing at the end of 2020 to do a couple of things. We engineers don't think of failure. We think as opportunity for a lesson learned. All right, failure is no option, and I don't consider anything that happened in 2020 from a TAC perspective as any sort of failure. But it did give us a chance in December to really look hard at the recommendations that came in. They were great recommendations from our perspective. It gave the TAC and anybody who's interested in the outside of the membership of the TAC to digest the voluminous recommendations and the background material behind it. We also have before us a pretty comprehensive AI working group white paper. So I think that in the intervening month or so that we've had a chance to really dig into some of the AI topics that we might not otherwise have had an opportunity trying to rush things through late December. So again, thank you for everybody for joining us today. I'm not going to take a lot of time with my remarks here because we do have a lot ahead of us. But your point also, Dennis, about the transition, of course, with any transition, even if it isn't a change in administration, when there's leadership changes in federal agencies, especially the Federal Communications Commission, there's always a need to brief the new leadership on all the activities from the Bureau and Office perspective, and the TAC is no exception there. We're committed to making sure that the leadership in the commission are well informed of all the TAC activities, the actionable recommendations that we're coming up with, and the state of play with respect to the next cycle and the membership for the next cycle. That will you have my commitment not to lose that in the shuffle. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Ben.
Great, and let me allow other key members of the FCC team to provide their input, and in particular, Manisha, if you would like to provide your thoughts and welcome and all the rest, please take it away.
Thank you, Dennis. First of all, let me wish everybody a happy new year. I feel like we are assembled to certify a vote, and I hope this one proceeds much better than other certifications that we've seen happen lately. I don't really have much to add to what Ron said. I think the TAC has done an excellent job this year. The 135-page AI white paper, I think that is something that not only within FCC, but the entire federal community will be looking at very carefully, and outside as well, because some of the best minds have come in to put all the thoughts down. It's very comprehensive. And the rest of the working groups too, amazing output. Look forward to summarizing everything. We had a very detailed debrief in December, and then look forward to the final vote. So I'll keep it short, and I'll back to you, Dennis.
Great. Thank you. Let me move to our designated federal officer. Michael, if you would like to give us an overview of the session and your thoughts and comments.
Sure, thank you, Dennis. As people said, I appreciate especially the early risers. Some of us are dialing early, and I can see like a glimpse of a sunrise through Jack's window in the back from California. And never needless to say that the level of efforts that we put together for the final recommendations, as well as the white paper, is also reflected on the number of inquiries I was getting as a DFO from the industry, from the outside of tech members. So there's a tremendous people looking at and trying to learn more about what we have done and what we're recommending. So I'd like to thank everybody putting their resources. Also, need to note that this is all voluntary work. So really appreciate people making time on top of all the professional duties that everybody has. Also, just wanted to touch on another question that I was getting quite a bit is about some of the additional members and interest in becoming a tech. member for 2021. We are required to recharter, every 2 years. So we will be doing that in 2021, and we'll be following the past practices, meaning that there will be a public notice issued sometime in late March, early April for the open nomination for the tech membership. And many of you already went through that 2 years ago, so I'm assuming you will be familiar with it. And people who are watching this and looking to participate or looking for the opportunity, look out for the public notice that will be coming out, and we'll just follow the same steps we did 2 years ago. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Dennis.
Okay, and our alternate federal designated federal officer is Martin. And Martin, do you have any comments or thoughts?
No, I don't think I can add much to what's been said already, just to say that I'm glad to be here, and thanks to all of you for your efforts.
And thank you again for filling in last time. Sometimes there's questions, why do we have an alternate? Well, last meeting was a very good reason, represented a very good rationale for having an alternate when Michael had his sad trip to South Korea. But Martin, we do appreciate your efforts. Moving on then, Michael, why don't you do the roll call? One of the nice things you can, with the ever improving virtual meeting capabilities, you can almost do these virtual visually around the table, but please take it away, and don't get too quickly into Nomi, since her mouth is full. So
It's one of the disadvantages.
I couldn't resist, Nomi.
Thanks. Yeah, you caught me super casual and eating a late breakfast.
All right,
Okay.
very good. Michael, please, we'll take on the roll call.
Yeah. So Brandon Abley representing NENA. Nina. Okay.
Yeah, you will have to flip. Many of you are on mute. In fact, basically all of you are on mute, so we'll have to make sure you flip off mute when you're responding.
And Shahid Ahmed representing Equity.
Yep, I'm here, Michael. Good morning.
Good morning. And Mark Bellis is representing Visual Link Internet.
Here.
Good morning, Mark. And Nomi, you're here.
Yes.
And Bill Chak representing NCTA.
Good morning, I'm here.
Good morning, Bill. And Lynn Cloudy representing NAB.
Good morning, Lynn is here.
Good morning, Lynn. Marty Cooper representing Dyna LSC.
Good morning.
Good morning, Marty. And Brian Daly from AT&T.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Brian Daly.
Good morning. And we Satish Danaskaran from Keysight. Satish, are you on mute by any chance? Okay, maybe he will join us a little late. And Adam Jobert, I see you. Adam, thank you for joining.
Good morning, present.
And Jeff Forster from Intel.
Yes, good morning, I'm here.
Good morning. And Dick Green representing Liberty Global.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Dick. And Lisa Guess, I see you there.
I'm here.
Thank you, Lisa. Just make a note that Lisa has joined TAC as an alternate member representing Ericsson since the acquisition of Ericsson buying the Cradle Point that she used to represent. And she is here to present the AI Working Group final recommendation. And the voting will be done by Stephen Hayes, who is the member of the Ericsson. Russ Gehrig from Cisco.
Hello, good to be here.
Morning. And Dale with that longest beard for the tech members, I see you. And Stephen Hayes from Ericsson.
Present. Good morning.
Good morning, Stephen. And Mark Pass from Comcast.
I'm here. Thank you.
Good morning, Mark. And Peter Coons, representing Boeing Company.
Present. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Peter. And Kari Kwamamaki.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning, Kari. And Steve Lanning from Viasat.
Steve Lanning here.
Good morning. And Greg Leppin, representing ARRL. I saw you earlier.
Good morning, Michael, and the rest of the tech.
Yeah, good morning. And Kevin Leddy from Charter.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning, Kevin. And Brian Mark Walker from CEA or CTA.
Yes, good morning. I'm here. Thank you.
Good morning. And Marla Medin from Google. And Lynn Merrill, representing NTCA.
So I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. And Paul Meisner from Amazon.
Paul's there. You're on mute, Paul.
There are multiple mutes. Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Paul. And Jack Zelsky from Qualcomm.
Thanks, Michael. Hello, everyone.
Good morning, Jack. And Michael Nawrocki from Addis.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, Mike. And Art Nichols from Windstream. And Madeline Nolan from ATSC.
Good morning.
Good morning, Madeline. And Ted Rappaport from NYU Wireless. And we have Dennis Roberts in our chair. Jess Russell from Inc. Networks. And Travis Russell from Oracle. And Hans Jürgen Schmidt from Facebook. Marvin Servo from Carnegie Mellon.
I'm here.
Good morning, Marvin. And Kevin Sparks from Nokia Bell Labs.
Good morning, Mike and all. I'm here.
Good morning, Kevin. And Paul Steinberg from Motorola Solutions.
Good morning, Michael and all.
Good morning, Paul. And Tom Sawanabori from CTIA.
Yes, good morning. Tom's here.
Good morning, Tom. And David Tannenhouse from VMware.
David's here, but he's on mute.
He might be.
No, I had gone off mute. Did you not pick that up?
Thank you, David. Yep.
We can hear you now.
Yep, we hear you. And the other David Young from Verizon.
Good morning, Michael. David Young from Verizon here.
Good morning. And Tom Van Meter from Juniper.
Hi, I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning, Tom. And lastly, Charlie Zhang from Samsung.
Good morning, Mike. Charlie is here.
Good morning, Charlie. So I think we have a very good attendance today. And if anyone else joins, please let me know, or I should be able to see it, and we'll pick it up and reflect that attendance. And with that, let me turn it back to you, Dennis, to get us started. And let me go ahead and share the screen here.
Yeah, I think you can put up the agenda. Then next, there we go. And so the order, you all should have this anyway, but we will jump into artificial intelligence with not only the recommendations, but the discussion of the white paper, and then with each those recommendations that you have from your working group on topics, you can present those as well. Again, we had many of those in the last meeting, but we'll cover that more thoroughly in this meeting. And as we get to the end, if your favorite topic hasn't been covered in the closing remarks period or just before that, we'll receive any additional ideas that you all have. But with that, let's jump into the artificial intelligence work. And Lisa and your sidekick, the no longer bearded one, please take it away.
All right, I'll get started before the no longer bearded one.
If we could go to the next slide. Just quick listing of all the members. I just want to make a comment once again. This has been the most engaged working group I've worked with in my, I think now 6 years on the TAC, and a warm and hearty thank you to all of you for all the work that you helped put into the discussion and the white paper and the recommendations. So we could go on to the next slide. I think it's important to understand, not only as we get to our recommendations, but also as we think about the white paper. We spent a lot of time, in fact, quite often we met 2 times a week, and we listened to many industry experts. So we started out with issues addressed. These were our objectives. And, you know, I'm not going to read them to you for time's sake. You can read those yourself. And what did we want to do with those? So we carefully considered, you know, this broad topic of these 4 issues and how do we cover them. We considered the strategic priorities, including the strategic plan. We quite often would refer back to the FCC strategic plan. The industry trends that we heard quite often from our experts. It was also important that the technology maturity was within a window of, you know, somewhere in the next 1 to 3, possibly 5 years, so that we weren't off in a sci-fi, although fun that would be. We wanted things that could impact the industry and be mature technically and be timely, able, as we have some of the pilot projects, they needed to be able to be completed in a very timely manner so that we can learn quickly. And also a higher impact. So what are some of the pain points? So when we crossed the issues with the considerations, we had inputs from many presentations, wonderful interaction with our FCC liaisons. We had subgroups this year that met quite often. Actually, not even subgroups. It was SME discussions that would be 4 or 5 that would meet for an hour every week for several weeks. So I feel like we really got a lot out of everyone's brains from the experts that are on our group. And the nature of the recommendations is the things we really tried to focus on is what could have a lasting impact on the FCC. How can we look at next year, and with AI, FCC strategy and data, we came up with those as really important issues. Immediate impacts on the FCC, consumers, public sector, service providers, and the broadband map pilot, safe use of AI in pilot projects. So that's really the nature where we ended up focusing. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just jump right to the recommendations. Because what I'm trying to do is leave plenty of time for Adam so we can discuss what's in the white paper. You've seen this slide before. Hopefully you've had time to digest it. But we've identified 5 areas. So the first one being unlock transformational change. And we felt the best way to do that wasn't to request a new paper or a new activity. Really, let's import considerations for AI into an existing FCC strategic plan the next time it gets a major update or when the FCC may decide to do that. There's already quite a good plan out there. We feel that, and this is covered in the white paper, some things that can go in there. The second recommendation is to build knowledge, unleash the data. So many of the groups we spoke with, especially the DARPA groups, the thing that was a common thread, and frankly, I didn't expect it to be this common, was that they had difficulty accessing common and broad sets of data that were reliable and curated. So one of the recommendations is to create a task force and address how the FCC can look at important aspects of data governance and curation. And we were very careful not to recommend, what we're not recommending is that private industry give up data and the FCC own it. That is not what this means. The FCC has already a lot of its own data that could already be curated, and that's where the task force should start. serve its internal needs using its own data and publicly available data to help the public, the industry, and internal needs. The third one is cast a wide net. So develop a plan and strategy for designing, developing, maintaining a broadband map that takes advantage of the best technologies and capabilities available. I believe this is covered quite well in the white paper, but it's essentially send out a document just asking the industry, where can you contribute? And it's, again, I want to emphasize, it's not demanding data from any operators. It's casting a wide net. There are multiple sources of data that could help us have a more granular broadband map. The fourth one is keep humans in control of the loop. This was a really important notion that we got from Stuart Russell, an expert in this area, to say the least. If you just turn on AI, you now can really impact your network if you don't keep humans in control of the loop. So we need to make sure that as we incorporate more and more AI, we have policies and approaches to ensure the safe use. That again is covered in the white paper in several places. And then 5, get your feet wet and just do some pilot projects. We have outlined several that the FCC may choose from that will help solve near-term issues and problems and are able to be completed in a relatively short term with a near-term return. So that's it for the recommendations. Dennis, I don't know if you want to stop and debate or let us go on to Adam and the white paper.
Yes, we should at this point solicit any inputs or thoughts. Again, this has been presented, but we haven't had, in my mind, adequate opportunity outside of the working group, which is a large working group, but outside for any other input. So this is your chance. Thoughts, comments, expansions from anyone in the TAC? I am amazed that there are not, although I guess there has been. Yes, go ahead.
How do we grab your attention? Raise hand?
Good point. Good point. Yeah, if you would raise your hand, there is that opportunity. If you want to, yeah, use the raise the hand would be good.
All right, let me lower that. So Lisa, I noticed that just 2 days ago, the White House Office of Technology came out with an AI initiative. Were you in contact with them over the past year at all? Was your group?
We actually tracked the output from that group. And if you look at the much larger presentation that was done December 1st, it actually has references to the national plan. Okay. And there have, in fact, been sort of a succession of activities in that. I think the latest was actually something that Paul Steinberg pointed us to. And again, you'll find reference to that in the larger presentation that was done December 1st.
Yeah, and I would add, yes, in the longer presentation, we do note that there are several activities that have some overlap and urged caution not to do overlapping work, but work cross-functionally.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you also for the reminder that to use the raised hand, or if you want to submit it as a chat item, a message item, that's fine as well. You can tee up and get your thoughts captured in written form. Okay, not seeing any more.
Dennis, I see a raised hand somewhere in the lower left.
You do? I don't.
Pete.
Yep, that's me.
Okay, please.
Pete Coons from Boeing. So just a comment or potential adder.
Oh, there we go.
On your number 2 item around curation of data. It may be in there. I apologize. I haven't reviewed the entire white paper. But a critical element around artificial intelligence and data is not only the curation and filtering of the data itself, but also either the provisioning for structure by the end user or structure at the curation level, whether this is used for training or whether this is used for validation or verification of the methodology. So a critical part of the data lake is creating those ability to structure or a priori structure to data. And that's crucial.
Yeah. So Pete, in fact, I would say one of the main things that I think this is what you're addressing, is data tends to actually grow in value if it's put together in the right form, actually cataloged, so it can be structured for many different purposes. And I think we covered that explicitly.
Okay, thank you.
It's in the longer presentation from December 1 and the white paper, but very good point.
Yeah. Yeah, and it means really a change in philosophy of how you deal with data at a pretty fundamental level.
Historically, we tend to think of just simply archival, but you know, imagine getting the printed phone book and trying to do something with it.
Yeah, it's both archival, and then it tends to be funded for a single purpose, while its much broader uses where the value is. Okay, so both of those things interplay with that.
Yeah, this is actually, and it's noted in the white paper. We're rapidly getting into the white paper, but exactly extending the point that Adam has just made. National Science Foundation, for instance, has been very helpful in funding academic research to generate data, but is loath to provide funding to transform that data in the way that we're talking about now into a much more useful format.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see another hand, Dennis. TS.
Tom. Yeah.
Yes, good morning. I had a question, and it's addressed somewhat in the paper, so if you want to talk about it then, that's fine as well. But wanted to understand better how what the thought process is and how you would go about the broadband mapping, and what kind of AI tools and machine learning tools would be brought to bear, and then how do we understand, like, do we know that those are more accurate, more comprehensive? Are there still kind of holes in the information that might be present, even if you use those tools? I'm just trying to understand that a little bit better.
Yeah, Tom, when we go into the white paper, let me come back to that issue. Okay.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Okay, and I will yield to Lisa, since I'm not as good at spotting the raised hands as she is, but I don't see any more raised hands.
I don't see any either.
Okay, so why don't we transition, since we already seem to be transitioning into the white paper, and take it away.
Okay. Can we go back one view graph, Michael? Let's see. Thank you. Okay. So I think I'll be handling this this section. So let me first of all say that while I may have had a hand in trying to put a lot of this together in paper in some coherent way, there really were a number of teams that contributed very deeply to it. And it was our members on the TAC, some of the SMEs that we have as alternates, and then quite a bit of dialogue with the FCC staff on various aspects of the work in front of us. What you will find is, if you look at the briefing that was done on December 1st, By and large, the white paper follows the material in the briefing and really sort of covers the bulk of it with maybe a little bit more granularity than what you will find in the briefing itself. So there are two parts to this. There's around 35 pages, which are really the body of the white paper. We expect most people to take a look at this. That consists of 5 sections. The first one is an executive summary. It really is a brief description of what we did, how we consider what we consider AI to be, a little bit of the considerations that were taken into account, and then it ends with the five high-level recommendations that you just saw Lisa go over. In the next section, which is section 2, it provides the context for the working group. Again, important aspects of what AI is about, its progress, but also some of the shortfalls. In fact, that's sort of grist for some of the recommendations for what we ought to be doing next year. The next one, the next section, really tries to figure out the filters for what it is that would be important to the FCC. And in considering that, we looked at what's important to the FCC internally, what's important to the operators, what's important to industry in general, what's important to consumers. So a fairly broad view of where AI and ML, and really a lot of focus on ML as opposed to AI writ large, is covered in that section. And this is what led us to 5 areas of recommendation. So what you will find is that section 4 that follows is a more detailed look at those 5 areas. The first one is leads to the recommendation on the AI strategic plan. Again, if you look at it in context, the big area in this setting is really digital transformation. It applies to the private sector. It applies to government. AI and AI tools end up being a very important part of that, of actually extracting value from going down that path. So it sort of develops that part of the story. The next one is the importance of data. And I think to paraphrase what Lisa said previously, many of the groups that came to talk to us, and by the way, these were groups from academia, doing basic research, DARPA doing applied stuff, and even people from industry and the vendor community who said that the single largest impediment to progress in AI and AI tools as applied to networking is really availability of data. Okay? And so we explored the role that the FCC could play in that regard. Whether it's organized on a voluntary basis, whether it's sharing of models that use the data, I think all of those kind of things are looked at there. The next thing that we looked at is issues around the broadband map. Where can AI be used? Again, it develops that part of the story. And I think to Tom Sonobori's question, I think you'll find an illustration both there and in the appendices that talks about where it is that AI can bring value. I would say, no, we don't have a full feeling for what's possible, what's not, who's got the right tools where. And in fact, that was part of the motivation for issuing something like an RFI as part of the procurement process that the FCC uses, so that can be flushed out. Okay. The next area that we looked at is safe uses of AI. Again, a very thoughtful team, a lot of good presentations in that area. I would say Section 4 probably does a very limited job on that. If you look at the details in the appendix, they really expand on the issues, and I would say lay the groundwork for some of the things that ought to be looked at in possibly this year and in the following years. And then lastly, to extract value in a meaningful way from the use of AI and machine learning tools, we have a fairly large catalog of potential applications. I think we chose 5 of those to expound on in the appendix. And the recommendation is that the FCC should pick 2 or 3 of them, get its feet wet, because I think in terms of everything from mindset to technical capability, having an understanding of this area is very important for the future. And I think that sort of concludes what the body of the white paper is. If you were to go on to the next view graph. Okay. We have a number of appendices. They contain a lot more detail. The first of those, I would say extremely useful just to get a feeling for things, is an annotated bibliography. This was done by Gabriel Lennon, who was an intern at the University of Colorado. And it looks at the peer-reviewed literature, where things are actually being done, all the way from sort of the nitty-gritty hardware components that make up the network, the protocols, all the way up the stack to understanding things like customer sentiment, its uses in marketing, etc. Fairly well done, and I would sort of urge people to, in the least, take a look at it. The next appendix deals with federally funded initiatives in AI. I would characterize a lot of that work as sort of early days, but it's very indicative, and I think illustrates tools that may be useful for the FCC in its deliberations. So quite a deep look at that. The area of spectrum usage is so prevalent in this industry right now. We did take a very close look at DARPA Spectrum Collaboration Challenge. Lessons learned from that, what they did do, what they did not do, and a little extrapolation of how the techniques that were used by DARPA in that experiment may be applicable to something that has commercial viability. Big section on data management, what data is all about. I think it addressed some of the issues that were asked as a question. So a fairly broad look at it. I will tell you, if I look at the amount of material that we have here compared to an exercise that's going on at NIST, I would say they have published 11 volumes at this point, each one longer than this white paper. Okay, so it's a fairly deep area, lots of important things going on there. Safe uses of AI. I think the sentiment from a few folks that I got as comments is you could have put more material in the body of the paper, but what you will find is that good description of the issues. I think it develops a philosophical framework for how to look at where AI is used, the injection points, because things are done on a very fast time scale for functions like network control, all the way to archival activities that last for years, where AI is associated with a process that again runs over a long period of time. Okay, but a lot of details, all the way from considering the bias that you will find in AI algorithms, the philosophy of how to deal with AI in the first place. I think we do have a reference to the issue that Paul Steinberg brought up, that OMB just did a circular on how AI ought to be treated in policy, a very sane approach. And so, again, I'd say a good starting point on the subject. The next appendix deals with the national broadband map. It covers oops. Sorry, it covers the uses of AI, the current state of where mapping is, and I would say a pretty good look at a process that could be used to really sort of get the best capabilities in building one for the future. And then the last section, the appendix, deals with pilot projects. And I think we have 5 of those fairly well fleshed out. And then, following that, there's a list of the speakers that we've had a year. Okay, so those are the content. I think the best guide for it is actually the long presentation that was done in December. So I think I'll stop at this point and see whether we can take any questions.
And we do have some hands raised, at least on my screen. Oh, there we go. Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Adam, Lisa. Question I had was on your item number 4 on safe AI, and I noticed in your recommendation, you talk about policies and approaches for the safe use of AI in communications and nations networks. I didn't have a chance to read the appendix on this one, so there might be more detail there. But really, my question is, in your work, did you envision that this would lead to actually regulatory policies in the FCC?
So let me put it this way, and I think we had a great team on this. It was Naomi Bergman, Dave Tannenhouse, and Sujata, maybe a couple of other people. Dave, it might be worthwhile if you would like to make a comment on it. From my viewpoint, I suspect there may be some aspects, but it's not necessarily the preferred way of dealing with it. And then I think, again, I'm going to point to the OMB circular that Paul Steinberg came up with. That one actually is a policy piece on how federal agencies should deal with AI and regulatory issues. And I think the suggestion was common sense and a light hand.
Okay.
Okay. But
all right, thanks, Adam.
We weren't recommending that anybody do any regulation at this point. Okay. Other than to say that that the regime that ought to be levied on the operators is no heavier than the regime applicable to any other providers of AI.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, just stepping in there, Adam, just with a slight, let me expand a little bit. One is we tried to use things like encourage and incentivize, right? So you'll notice those words to avoid sort of direct regulation. The other just slight twist is depending on sort of the nature of the use in the network, or, so for example, if an operator is really offering an over-the-top service or the equivalent to an over-the-top service, our view was, they should have to follow whatever rules other commercial folks providing similar services follow. So if there are FTC requirements, that might be a place where the FTC may weigh in, for example. On the other hand, the one place I'd sort of tighten a little bit on what Adam said is, if it's got to do with, say, the operation of the network, then they may be encouraged to follow the same sorts of requirements that other operators of critical infrastructure require. So we were trying to basically say, try to, for as much as possible, keep the playing field roughly the same and similar. And look to reuse things that exist elsewhere.
Yep.
Okay. So would that include sort of transparency type requirements, which sometimes can be difficult with AI, since it's not very transparent?
It could. So again, if it's saying let's look at over the top, right? And you have things like ad insertion. And our offers being made in certain areas to certain individuals and not to other classes of individuals, et cetera. And is the system unfair or biased, and should there be transparency about that? Right. If it's sort of, our view was that, look, if this is a kind of similar commercial service to those that might be offered by somebody over the top, probably the FCC should take a light hand. We weren't opining on whether or not the FTC might get very involved, because that's kind of traditionally been a place that they would tend to more take the lead. On the other hand, if it has to do, let's say, with network planning, and whether or not, as you use AI to plan the network, is it biased about, say, putting cell sites and into different geos in ways that are going to create unfairness in the services that are provided. There, the FCC would have more of an interest in promoting transparency in particular. So that's just to give you an example. But again, I would expect that to be similar for other critical infrastructure providers.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, the examples are helpful to make it more concrete.
Great. And then Kevin, and some of those examples are in places like footnotes, et cetera. As Adam indicated, the paper, you all saw how long it got. So a lot of things we were asked to move to the appendix. So that some of these are in the appendix, and sometimes even just as footnotes. There's discussions of transparency in particular. Just to add one thing, which is, there are places where you may be embedding AI right into the control. Think of this as the very short time constant control loops of the network, and in ways where conceivably if these fail or interact with other control loops, they could cause widespread outage. Notice
systemic failures.
Yeah, we use the vocabulary human in control of the loop, because now you're talking about AI/ML that's running faster and than the human could possibly be in the loop. So they can't be in the loop, but we can try to make sure that they're in control of it.
Which is probably more about putting limits of operation on.
Correct.
Because you can't put humans inside those kind of loops.
Right. And there, what we actually called for, but not so much regulatory as encourage and incentivize, is that operators and their suppliers adopt frameworks for analysis of these, and we identified different criteria. We've kind of provided here are some of the questions a framework might cover. That's a chart in the appendix, and we'd used that in the presentation at the last meeting. And what we're basically sort of saying is, the FCC should encourage and incentivize operators to disclose the framework they're using. Notice that doesn't say all the details of the evaluation. It says, tell people, hey, we have, evaluated our stuff against this framework. And the idea being that, by disclosing the framework, you're implicitly saying that you have, complied with that framework. And we go
you have
further
real processes in hand, actually.
Right, and we go further and suggest the FCC encourage and incentivize folks in the industry to work together to form common frameworks so that, not only will things be comparable, but expertise will grow within the industry, and people will be, have a common vocabulary and be able to move. But again, and we even provided some examples, like in the software space, you have the capability maturity model from CMU that's been out for a very long time. In the security space, you have the MITRE attack framework. So we put those forward, but the language is always encourage and incentivize and I think in some cases it was even consider encouraging incentivizing, right? To try to keep the light hand while identifying the places that could be a concern. And as I said, thinking of things like, disclose the framework as opposed to disclose all your vulnerabilities or all of your, the IP, et cetera, that might be behind what you're doing.
Sure.
So that was kind of philosophically the approach. I'm sorry to take so long, Dennis.
Okay. I think we have one more hand. It's Russ.
Hey, Adam and team. Just a quick comment on the broadband mapping. I'm a big supporter of this report. However, the mapping is a very, at best, two-dimensional type view. And with AI, I think we could really make a stronger recommendation related to a more interactive tool that shows more of the parameters related to broadband. I think we shouldn't just try to apply AI. My point is not just apply AI to the existing mapping methodology, but to consider reinventing a completely new interactive dashboard.
No, Russ, in fact, that's the heart of the recommendation and the reason of going out and seeing what's available, okay? Because we came across quite a few tools that are in fact 3D, that come out of the planning world. And in fact, one of the best presentations we heard was from Martin Gilbert from AT&T, who actually talked about the advances of the role that AI can play there. Okay.
Yeah, just one other comment related
with that.
One other comment related to David's response. There was a presentation we had from Sierhouse Martin Nissan related to automation of automated vehicles or autonomous vehicles. Yep. And his proposal was to insert a human in the loop, at least in the short term. So that's not an impossibility, and there are proposals out there supporting that.
Yeah, very much so. Good.
Let me just jump in there, Russ. That was actually a great example, and I'm glad you brought that one up. Of what we call human in control of the loop, and that his scheme is actually that when when the vehicle comes across an unexpected situation, it basically pauses and contacts the control center.
Yeah.
Right, and so it goes into a safe operating mode. It does something known safe. So we think of that as, again, human in control of the loop. The human's not trying to, sort of from the remote control center do the very detailed driving, or tuning of the, so for an example would be at that point, they're not trying to, control the power feedback loop on the engine, assuming it's an electronic system.
Right. Operations.
They're not trying to do the things that are operating at kilohertz.
Yeah.
Yeah, that wouldn't scale.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, not seeing any more hands raised. It is time for us to move to that which we didn't accomplish in the December meeting, but I'm really pleased that we've had the additional conversation and additional time to digest the work of the AI working group. So I'm actually really pleased that we're at this point. But could I solicit well, we have a recommendation, but could I solicit the voting now on first the recommendations from the AI working group for approval as TAC level, no longer working group, but as TAC level recommended or actionable recommendations? All those in favor, if you would go off mute for a moment and signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Well, that was kind of a weak set of ayes. Sounds like
Let's do it again.
moan coming out.
Let's do it again. Let's do it again.
Okay, do it again with some enthusiasm. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Oh, much better. Much better. Okay. Now, those opposed, same sign for the actionable recommendations. Okay, we will take that as unanimous. Next, moving to the white paper. All those in favor of approving the white paper as a TAC level document, please signify by saying aye with enthusiasm.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, same sign. Okay, we will take that as unanimous as well. So we will move forward, and we have a set of actionable recommendations and a white paper that are TAC level, and that's a significant accomplishment. With that, we'll move to the next working group, which is the future of unlicensed operation. And Kevin and Brian, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Dennis. We'll be much briefer here. As you all recall, the Unlicensed Operations Working Group found that unlicensed spectrum has tremendous value for the U.S. economy and that more unlicensed spectrum should be made available. In our December report, we commended the FCC for its expansion of unlicensed and lightly licensed at 6 gigahertz, 5.9, 60 gigahertz, and CBRS. But we concluded that the economy would benefit from even more unlicensed spectrum, and that it could be made available from the use of sharing technologies. So our group spent the second half of 2020 focused on how those sharing technologies had been used in the market and how they might be expanded to other bands, both federal bands and non-federal bands. We came up with 3 recommendations. I'll give the first and then hand it off to Brian. Our first is that the FCC should continue its light touch approach to unlicensed spectrum and allow industry to collaborate to determine the best methods for sharing the airwaves. The FCC should avoid further codifying standards and regulation and allow industry to define technical specifications. So we found that the light touch regulations allow standards bodies to create the best solutions and to support international interoperability, sort of a continuation of the recommendation from the unlicensed group from 2015. Our second recommendation, which Brian will get into in a minute here, is that when requirements and conditions evolve, so should the regulations. And in particular, we recommend a rulemaking on personal radars be opened on 60 gigahertz spectrum, where the FCC has received several waiver requests to use the spectrum for personal radar. The FCC should move from waivers to rules. And Brian did a tremendous amount of work on this over the year and has come up with a very specific recommendation that he'll go over now. If you could back up one, Michael, to, there we go.
There we go. Thank you. Can you hear me, Kevin?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. And these are repeats, so I will be quick, but we did want to put a bit more detail here because we are recommending a rulemaking here. And so to go over this issue again, in the 60 gigahertz band, which of course has unlicensed operation, that includes a radar, field disturbance sensors. And so there are existing rules that cover that are paraphrased here, actually quoted here. And you see in bold the main issue, the main power limits for these personal radar field disturbance sensors. So there are companies that were exploring, in particular, Google wanted to introduce its technology for gesture recognition with its phone, the SOLI, SOLI technology. So it requested a waiver. There were, as that request was being handled with its own docket, there were other requests that came in, other waiver requests that came in. Those were all kind of in the automotive space. In particular, so Google's, as I mentioned, has been introduced in its product line in a phone, but there are companies that are interested in doing radar sensing, gesture control type, or presence sensing actually inside of vehicles. So the Google waiver was granted, and you see the power limits in bold font there, the changes or what was allowed. So a slight tweak to the power limits, and there was also kind of a duty cycle put in place that had to do with fairness for the communication systems that also occupy the 60 gigahertz band. And as we've noted before, this is limited to Google. It's a grant or the waiver request for Google. It was not a general grant for everybody who wanted to use these same limits, and that is why there still needs to be some action undertaken. Next slide, please. So we did bring in parties that were part of this whole docket and engaged, and this was not just those interested in the personal radar application. It includes those who are using 60 gigahertz for unlicensed communications. And in fact, so we had briefings from Google, Facebook, Intel, and Qualcomm as part of our discussion. And there is an industry group that's noted here in the second bullet that is continuing with the discussion of how to best make use of the 60 gigahertz band for both of these applications. So that work continues, and they did put that was noted in the docket, so that's public information. But everybody that we've talked to has indicated, including this coexistence working group, that it's time to consider this in a docket and adjust rules, as the outcome of that docket suggests. Next slide, please. So in the top box here is our recommendation. Below that, potential areas of consideration. Those are just things that were talked about, that came up, that we've presented before. We don't presume to tell the SEC what to include in a proceeding if they do wish to tee one up. But our recommendation is that they FCC undertake a rulemaking proceeding to examine these rules that are found in 15.255 to address the issues that these multiple parties now brought up in the form of waiver requests for field disturbance systems. And again, field disturbance systems is the CFR language for these kinds of radar-like systems. So that's it. Kevin, I'll turn it back to you to wrap up your last part.
All right, if you go to the next, yes, thank you. All right, so let's look at our third recommendation, which is that the FCC should dedicate a TAC working group to focus on spectrum sharing in 2021. I think we saw potential to unlock large swaths of spectrum for public use. And what we found through the analysis of the existing sharing technologies is that there are, quote, many tools in the tool belt. And it's not clear which sharing technologies should be used on which bands. But we did find that there needs to be a careful alignment between those technologies, the incumbents in the bands, and the use cases being proposed. So what we're hoping that there can be a further study group. And specifically what that group might do is re-examine a lot of the sharing approaches that we analyzed in the second half of the year and summarize those better than we had time to do. Examine the sharing technologies that are in the marketplace, the history of how those technologies were developed, and more importantly, what lessons have been learned now that they're deployed, and maybe suggest opportunities to improve the technologies based on a real-world application. Next, we'd want to look at any other sharing technologies that may be coming out of the standards groups and see whether some of those might be more effective for sharing new bands. One of the things that we heard over and over again from industry that is starting to use the SAS sharing system is that more KPIs and metrics are necessary to start to measure whether SAS is working the way it should. In other words, are we getting the kind of efficiency from SAS that the Commission expected? Is the utilization of the CBRS bands going up as expected? And important for the incumbents, is the interference low? Do the incumbents need to worry about SAS managing interference correctly? As we said, I think in the previous report, in 2020, it probably didn't make sense to try to look at those heuristics. But by the end of 21, there will be several 100,000 devices out there using the CBRS spectrum and the SAS sharing technology. And so we should be able to start evaluating how effectively it works. Much of that data is already being generated by the SASs, the SAS providers, and it could be analyzed by the Commission. We think there are some other bands that may be candidates for sharing, 3.45 to 355, 3.1 to 345, 12 gigahertz, 4.9. The Commission knows these better than we do, but we think there are other candidates, both federal and non-federal bands that could be candidates for opening up more shared spectrum. One of the other topics that we weren't able to get to was the possibility of using low power devices in more bands. And we think that could be added to the TAC working group's questions for 21. I should note that all the working group co-chairs discussed this, and I think there's unanimous agreement that a sharing working group should be formed for 21. That's our recommendations.
That's terrific, and we do have a couple of hands raised. So Manisha, I think you were first up, so please proceed.
Thanks, Kevin, and the others of the working group. These are actually very actionable recommendations. I had a quick question on the 60 gigahertz. You mentioned that there is a working group that is formed by quite a few industry members. Can you comment on whether this working group is interacting with 802.11 that has developed the AD and AY standards for operation in unlicensed bands to work out coexistence methodologies?
I don't know for sure. It was my understanding, Manisha, that it was kind of an ad hoc group. They were talking amongst themselves, so to speak, to sort out the issues and see what kind of progress they could make as principals. So I'm not aware they've done anything directly with 802.11.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that, again, it's not FCC's place to do this, but to just encourage different parts of industry that are stakeholders in a sharing situation, right? There are always competing parties whenever you come to sharing spectrum, to come together in venues that they can truly hash out the coexistence problems before they arise. But otherwise, great recommendations. Thank you very much.
I would add some of the principals involved, like Carlos, the CTO for the wireless, Intel's wireless group, is involved in both activities. So I'm sure there's a lot of people overlap.
Thank you.
Terrific. I think, Tom Swanbara, you have the next hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. And thank you for the recommendations. I wanted to speak briefly about the spectrum sharing study. I think both the unlicensed group and the 5G working group were recommending a spectrum sharing study. So my suggestion is that, that those be sort of coordinated or moved into one overall spectrum sharing study if the group decides to vote in favor of that. That's comment number one. Number two is I think it's important as you all started to look at last year, I think lessons learned from TV white space, CBRS, and other spectrum sharing experiences so that we learn the lessons and where they're appropriate. Thirdly, I'd like to suggest that, if a group is formed that the membership is, focused in there and that you get the broad membership on that working group to make sure they're looking, we have adequate representation across the TAC, so that, this comes out of the unlicensed working group, and there's other groups that are, that have used more licensed spectrum. So we need a broad perspective on that. And lastly, I'd say on the your comment with regard to 3.45 to 3.55, I don't think it's appropriate to be, sort of suggesting that at this point in time, given the work that's already been done with the FCC, NTIA, DoD on that. I think there's already a path forward on that, and so any spectrum sharing study should not address that particular band.
I'm sure you're right, Tom. I just threw out some bands, but I knew that was a risky thing to do. So I think there are other candidates out there.
More forward-looking and more general was probably more appropriate, and that way, could include low, mid, and high bands wherever, So that's my comment.
Totally agree. And yes, there should be one combined group. I think there's a lot of material, and maybe there are sub-working groups that get formed, but yes, there should be just one working group. I would say that, that the range of sharing technologies is very broad, and you've got, a whole set of protocol-based approaches, and then you've got the database approaches, and both of those probably need a lot more study. But the database approaches, or the more managed approaches like SAS, the newer ones, I think could benefit a lot by better metrics and analysis.
Yeah. And there is a third, which is, I would say, use of AI and sensing incorporated in the sharing regime.
Yes.
Great. I think that there is a lot of enthusiasm around the sharing. We saw that at the December meeting, and certainly it's in evidence here as well. I don't see any more hands, so we move to the vote. All those in favor of adopting the recommendations from the unlicensed working group as TAC level recommendations, please signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
And those opposed, same sign. We will take that again as a unanimous adoption of the recommendation. So thank you, working group, for all your efforts. This has been very, very helpful, and your recommendations are well received and now official. So let's move on then to the 5G RAN Technology Working Group. And I would note we're right on schedule. So that's very, very good for the first two working groups to get us to that point.
Okay.
Tom and Kevin, you're on.
Yep. Thanks, Dennis. If you want to go to the next slide, just a kind of reminder of what the work group did, looking broadly across all the different technology areas in the RAN on an end-to-end basis, but focusing our attention really on the advanced antenna systems and their impact on interference and spectrum management. So I'm going to go to the next slide. This is also kind of just a reminder of why we focus most of our attention on the AAS area as the area that has the most impact on the things that the FCC is mostly, concerned with. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is the summary of the recommendations. They fall into 5 areas. So I'll go down those one by one. The first one had to do with looking at really kind of near-term practical best practices. There was a lot of work looking at the existing multi-stakeholder group work in a lot of different areas. What we distilled out of that was really a recommendation related to TDD synchronization, recognizing that there are a lot of trade-offs here between how fully, partially, or not you synchronize TDD systems that are operating either in the same band or adjacent bands, because if you strictly force synchronization, then you kind of force everybody to the same optimization point, which may not be what you want to optimize each system for. And if everything's unsynchronized, then you're really going to pay a penalty because you've got uplinks and downlinks, well, primarily downlinks squashing the uplinks due to the power, differential between the two. So this is really a recommendation to look, more closely at what the guidelines perhaps should be, under what circumstances synchronization should be stricter or perhaps looser, depending upon how, a lot of factors. So that's the first area. And Tom, this was the area you really took a lead on. So do you want to add anything to what I summarized there?
Just one thing is, as you look at future bands, and this is, the C-band multi-stakeholder group did look at this, and they did not decide on any specific recommendations. But I think when you go beyond that and you're looking to utilize bands that are, perhaps adjacent and utilize them without guard bands, which help to more fully utilize spectrum, some partial synchronization guidelines might be useful. But you need to think about, since they're flexible use spectrum, make sure that consider both different technologies that might be utilized and so forth. So I think TDD will be used a lot more in spectrum going forward, and we just thought it might be useful to develop some guidelines that would at least allow for some partial synchronization, and so development of those guides would take some additional work to do to examine.
Yeah. And I think this also has a relationship to one of the other 5G group, the 5G IoT group, in the industrial IoT space, where the consideration has to do with potentially dedicated spectrum for industrial uses and things like that. So the presence of that could modify what you do here if you've got more specialized spectrum, where you'd have more freedom to optimize your TDD uplink downlink allocations.
I told you. Yeah.
So
Yeah, so exciting.
Somebody probably needs to go on mute.
I'll take care of it.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. All right, the second area had to do with equipment authorization. And here the recognition of with advanced antenna systems, the old tried and true EIRP approach of characterizing antennas isn't fully valid, so you have to come up with ways to kind of translate to that. And the recommendation here is for the FCC to consider adding more directly field strength limits in their characterization of AES systems to complement the conventional methods for doing this. There are a couple areas for future study, which the first one is sort of related to the recommendation there of whether it's practical or not to try and characterize AES systems with a more sophisticated 3D kind of probabilistic type of power flux characterization, which might be useful in more optimal use of spectrum, particularly if you've got a sort of more advanced, maybe a data-based system that's taking advantage of that information and allowing greater use to the spectrum by not limiting the use of let's say power in the systems to the worst case scenarios which might not be applicable. And then the other area for future study has to do with power control, particularly on user equipment or end user devices, and the impact of that on out of band emissions. With the idea here that if you can prevent end devices from transmitting on their highest power or doing it infrequently, that you may be able to take advantage of that and get a higher performance overall in the system. So that's the second area. The third area is somewhat related to that recommendation in the second area. The first area has to do with equipment authorization. Here it's more about coverage and compatibility analysis purposes. But the recommendation is this is something that goes really beyond, I think, what a TAC group can do. A multi-stakeholder study looking at the possibility of proper ways of averaging radiated power measurements so that those can be used for coverage and compatibility analysis purposes, given the dynamics of AES RF propagations. So the fourth area has to do with transmitter identification, and this is especially for use in more deterministically determining interferers. So this would be a big help for both self-remediation, but also enforcement of violations. Here. There are a couple methods that we looked at to some degree. RF fingerprinting, which would make use of AI/ML and sort of signatures to try and identify very specifically what the transmitter is in a given case, which has a lot of advantages in terms of being sort of retrofittable to existing systems. Or complementing existing systems, and the other is a little bit more deterministic, using explicit transmitter identifiers, but ones that could be, let me say, more easily decoded than having to fully decode a full transmission stack signal, which again is very attractive from a deterministic standpoint, but would be mainly applicable to new systems going forward rather than be a difficult thing to retrofit into existing systems. Certainly would be expensive. So these two may indeed be complementary, but there is definitely more work that would be needed to be done here. This is probably again, this is not a way out in time type recommendation, and we think that this also would require a study with probably involving the standards organizations with academic and industry and federal agency inputs to try and work through what would one or the other be adequate. Also identify the feasibility for these, and of course the balance between effectiveness and feasibility would help steer what the right overall scheme should be. And then the final area, which is probably the most, oops, you can go back to the slide I was on, the summary slide. There you go. This is probably the most farthest out and far-reaching of the recommendations in this area. We looked at both short time cycle type of things, which in other words, taking existing optimizations that are done, let's say within a given system, like, let's say LTE, and trying to extend those or, generalize the particular metrics that are used, but apply the same methods for intersystem active interference management. So this would be kind of a midterm type of thing, probably, but a fair amount of work to work out what's practical to do in this area. So again, another one we felt was beyond probably the reach of a TAC work group to work out the details of this. The other, the last recommendation area here had to do with a longer time cycle, at least initially, use of really data-driven propagation models, which over time could become perhaps more and more localized to specific areas, metro areas, maybe parts of metro areas, and maybe eventually could get quite granular in its geospecificity. The view is that this would be something that would be used for more offline optimization purposes initially, although in the far time frame, we're thinking these two could actually perhaps come together, where these data-driven propagation models, if sophisticated enough and mature enough, could then actually start to be used inside of shorter optimization loops for optimizing interference management. So those are the 5 areas. I did include in the deck a little bit more detailed slides on each of these, but I think it's better probably to look at the whole set here on this slide for discussion. So with that, I'll, well, first of all, let me ask Tom, any points you wanted to bring out beyond what I summarized here?
No, nothing to add. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, well, with that, then we open it up to comments and questions.
And I'm not seeing any hands raised, so please raise your hand with your comments, questions, thoughts. All right, Brian, you are first up.
Yes, so Kevin and Tom, is very good presentation. Do your recommendations, do they apply to user equipment and base stations? Or are they only looking at base stations and related?
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of them apply to the network infrastructure, so the base stations and some would involve core networks as well, but some of them would impinge on user equipment. So the future study item related to power control on UEs is definitely a end user device impact. Also, in the active interference management area, the first area there has to do, well, typically interference management or all kinds of optimizations within the RAN involve parameters that are collected by UEs and then transmitted up into the network. So the UEs would be involved in those, and certainly if you come up with new schemes, it could leverage the existing mechanisms that the UEs already process and send up, or it could involve new ones that you know, additional parameters that could be sent up. So the answer is most of them have to do with the RAN, but there can certainly be impacts on the UEs as well.
Thank you.
Not seeing any other questions. I'll maybe pose one myself, and that's around the fourth one, the transmitter identification, which has certainly been a hot button for different ones, and especially Dale sitting. He's at my upper left-hand corner of my screen. But there was a similar working activity in CSMAC this past year and didn't really come to much of a conclusion there. Could you do any compare and contrast with the work in CSMAC and the work that was accomplished in that area of your working group?
This was an area that we didn't go into great depth on, and so I'm not familiar with the CSMAC work that was done, and that wasn't brought up in the work of the group. So I can't make that comparison. I would imagine that they would have probably gone into greater detail than we did. Our role was mainly to identify that this was certainly a very valuable thing, a very valuable tool in the arsenal, and kind of a short survey of what was possible out there, but without a real detailed look at it. This came fairly late in the year that we worked on this.
Dale, would you like to speak to that point?
I can say that the CSMAC is going to be meeting right after we do. If you want to tune into some of their discussion, but it was a fairly high priority thing in NTIA to have the CSMAC look at the identifier issue.
So maybe it's just a pointer to that work that we'll just tag on to the notion here. Because I think it is a really important one, and it relates to other areas as well. You know, when you get into moving vehicles, whether they're drones or cars or what have you, being able to know the source of the transmission is becoming increasingly important. So it is an important actionable one, and it is one that where it is not just an FCC issue, it is a much broader issue covering, and not just NTIA either, because it gets into Department of Transportation and DOD and other agencies of the government that are quite interested in this issue. So we just need to make sure that there is that proper focus, and that it does transcend just the commercial interests of the FCC. Okay, Madeline, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, just as a point of reference, ATSC 3.0 does have transmitter ID specified for the radio access network layer. And so if there's any value in having ATSC experts come and talk about how that was done, I'd be happy to offer that up.
Yeah, no, that would be a good existence proof, if you will. It would be good to see you know, how easy it is for a different system to extract that transmitter ID from the. So yeah, that would be very interested in seeing
Great.
that.
Yeah, we could tee it up for a future meeting should we have a working group in future meetings.
Okay. Thanks, Madeline. Appreciate that.
Okay, I am not seeing any other hands raised. So I think it's time for us to move then to the vote for adopting these recommendations as actionable recommendations at the TAC level. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 That was a very hearty aye, Dale. Appreciate you leading. All those opposed, please signify by the same sign. Okay, we will take that as unanimous adoption of the recommendations. So thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the good work. Both Tom and Kevin for your leadership and for the whole team. And that moves us then into our final working group, 5G and IoT working group. And the pressure is on. We're running actually 3 or 4 minutes ahead. So it's up to you, Russ and Brian, to take this portion of the agenda home.
Okay, this is Brian Daly. I'll start off, and hopefully we can keep it within your time limit. So yeah, as the previous slide showed, just again wanted to acknowledge the efforts that we had throughout the year and the working team members. Our charter really focused on 4 areas. Oh, you can move to the next slide. Yeah, we looked at Open RAN, some of the industry developments and overview, challenges and roadblocks, and so forth. IoT, specifically looking at spectrum aspects of IoT and the verticals and service requirements, where we're headed beyond 5G, which is termed as 6G, although that really is just a term that we've applied to it. It doesn't really exist yet, but we are looking at the technology trends, planning and obstacles, as well as what the engagement opportunity for the FCC might be. And then some other aspects such as spectrum sharing, which we heard from the other working group as well, looking at future needs, opportunities, and frameworks, as well as security, reliability, and resiliency as we progress into 5G. Next slide. As we all know, 5G is undergoing deployments. Here in the US, we're seeing all the major operators have 5G deployments, covering a good chunk of the population here in the US. We're seeing smartphones rolled out, which contain 5G capabilities. And elsewhere in the world, South Korea, China, Japan, and the UK, as well as others, are all in the 5G rollout phase. And CTIA provided us the data and that you see here on this screen. Next slide, please. We took a deep dive into standards and technical specifications update. Obviously, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on standards development in 2020 and now trickling into 2021. This has resulted in some delays on the standards timelines. And we're going to continue with that as at least through the first half of 2021, and it's really uncertain what's going to happen beyond that because of the vaccine rollout and the potential for face-to-face meetings on a global scale may be further delayed through the end of this year. We're hoping that the next coming months will bring some clarity on what the meeting situation will look like this year. But again, not holding out too much hope that we're going to get back to a sense of normalcy anytime soon this year. With that, there is the risk that if electronic meetings go beyond June, there could be potential further delays to 3GPP standards development in release 17 and 18. And the reason for this is the virtual e-meetings are less efficient than face-to-face. You lose things like the ability to have hallway discussions and dinner discussions and resolve contentious issues offline when you have virtual meetings. So this year will be interesting to see how that progresses and what any further impacts might be. On the ORAN side, they did release 20 new specifications since June of 2020, including some of the interface specifications and so forth that are required. And also the ORAN Alliance had a security task group that looked at some of the security challenges on all ORAN interfaces and components, and they're continuing to do that work as well. Next slide, please. We did make some recommendations on the Open RAN recommendation and the FCC role in that. First off is to encourage the development of the Open RAN ecosystem by supporting innovation, standardization, testing, as well as security and reliability. Also support open R&D opportunities, which includes research on open 5G and 6G technologies, as well as interoperability through public and private events such as plug fests and testing in existing 5G test beds. And then finally, generate awareness of the differences between Open RAN, new entrants, greenfield, and brownfield deployment timelines. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll turn it over to Russ, and we'll talk about some of the other aspects that we had looked at this year, including reliability. Russ?
Thanks. Thank you, Brian. So the working group did take a look at some of the power type reliability issues related to 5G. Of course, reliability of the power grid is essential for communications infrastructure. And so we had a couple of recommendations here and advisements. You know, we felt the FCC could leverage some of the efforts. The BDEC has done some work and a report on this, so we didn't want to duplicate there. And clearly, operators are already focused on meeting some of these critical demands. Also, wireless resiliency cooperative framework is a voluntary commitment to the FCC. And we would also recommend further collaboration with FERC, EPRI, and 911 operations in terms of power backup, resiliency, things like that. ADIS does have a working group on reliability that we did not get a chance to look deeply into, but they've issued a report. So the recommendation that we're making to the FCC is to carry the reliability, especially for safety type focus work, into 2021. And we'll get to a slide at the end of the deck talking about some potential areas along with that for continuation of this working group. Next slide. Brian covered a little bit on the 6G planning and research that's in progress. This is clearly well underway across industry. There's been a number of forums, conferences and so forth throughout 2020, and that will just continue or increase in terms of speed. While these happen roughly every 8 years, the different G changeouts, it's clearly time to get involved in some of the planning. So some of the particular areas that we called out that need attention, spectrum, and we've got a recommendation along with the wire unlicensed group, but planning to support 6G network requirements, architecture in terms of further densification, which will cause site location challenges, and then the XHAul in terms of fiber. The United States is not where it probably should be in terms of some of the front haul, mid haul, back haul capabilities related to fiber, and that's going to become very relevant the higher frequencies we get into, because it will call for more fiber, even with IAB uses. Some of the FCC research support that we recommend is high frequency millimeter wave as well as terahertz. This seems to be the focus for 6G to go after those type spectrums for uses. And I think everybody's aware of the propagation issues as you move up into the very high millimeter wave as well as terahertz. And then also focusing on some of the spectrum efficient technologies that could maybe enable some of those uses. Next slide. Actually, I'm going to skip this next slide. Let's go to the next one, because we do have a, it'll come out in the recommendation here. in terms of spectrum sharing. But let me go through these related to O-RAN. And we really had 5 areas for recommendation or advisement. On O-RAN, this one's more of an advisement, but there is some area for the FCC to support multi-vendor interoperability and PlugFest to further stimulate O-RAN deployments and industry adoption. So that's kind of a soft recommendation. O-RAN is something that's happening very clearly through industry, and it's being driven from some of the standards bodies as well as I would call requirement specification bodies. Security, this is one that, security will never go away, right? This is always a challenge, but specifically to 5G, spoofing, interference are real concerns. Then additionally, system supply chains, we've seen a lot of press about some of the concerns over the past year plus. And then there's some security concerns within multi-vendor systems. Just keep in mind, groups like O-RAN are addressing this. They have a task force to address some of these concerns as well. And then hitting on network reliability, resilience, it's an area to monitor and something that should be carried over, we feel, into 2021 for the TAC. 6G, really there's the focus again, lack of the fiber for the XHAul, as well as power reliability, as you have even an increased number of cell sites. And probably further disaggregation. Architectural changes, another one to keep an eye on. Mesh, evolved IAB. One of the things we do call for specifically is creating this U.S. roadmap, partner with the industry to do that. There's again some work being done in ADIS related to U.S. roadmap to maintain leadership. And then readiness of terahertz is really uncertain. Some research needs to be done there, echoing the previous slide. Spectrum sharing, we really met as I think all 4 working groups to support the potential for a spectrum sharing working group or effort within 2021. The viewpoint is to create some sort of a high-level framework review, as we're very much aligned with the unlicensed recommendation in terms of reviewing some of the existing technologies, but at the same point, start to look at more of an evidence-based type or data-driven spectrum sharing capability. Also, interference is a major issue that really needs to be managed, mitigated, and quantified related to spectrum sharing. And that's one of the challenges I think that will move forward. So the formal recommendation there is for a TAC working group to focus solely on that topic. And then related to industrial IoT, we did dive into a number of the IoT verticals throughout the year, looked at a lot of the use cases, the demands related to the latency, the QoS, speeds and feeds, if you want to call it, and everything from enterprise vehicles, industrial, et cetera. So the demands really vary quite widely, and even smart cities, by the way. Related to QoS and determinism. One of the things we're calling out is the option to explore locally licensed spectrum, similar to what BNetza has done in Germany. That's looking very successful. And then both midband and millimeter wave are suitable options to facilitate. One of the other key areas, though, is to drive spectrum efficiency and facilitate spectrum reuse wherever possible. So if we go to the next slide and then the next slide, because it's just a header. So our proposal for 2021 is really to focus on, Brian and I in the working group felt there was value in continuing, this is our input to the FCC, continuing the 5G RAN-ish working group, whatever it gets called. But focus on some of the transitions as industry moves from NSA to SA. Also to continue the focus on both Open RAN and virtualized RAN. 6G evolution could be included in that possibly, and focus on some of the key issues we've raised, like XHAul, edge storage, cloud interoperability, deep dive, as well as some of the multi-access radio access technology interop. And then IoT requirements, we could take another round at that and monitor how that's being deployed. impacts to private networks, technology roadmaps, again, spectrum advances in millimeter wave and terahertz, and understand and decide what could be potential areas for research. Small cell deployment and reliability is another topic. Network reliability and resiliency is one that we feel strongly needs to be carried over. And then just standards coordination based on post-COVID, which hopefully we get past fairly soon. And then, of course, security, not last but not least, jamming, spoofing, supply chain issues. I think as we look back at 2020, we should, a lot of people have a negative view, but I was thinking about this this morning when we were getting into this meeting. 2020 was an exceptional year when you think of 5G. Brian covered some of the coverage increases that happened related to 5G deployments in the United States. And just the spectrum advances were, I would say, options that will sort of set the stage, at least for the next 5 years, probably, in terms of auctions and so forth. So 2020 was actually a pretty good year when it comes to 5G and spectrum. That's all we've got. Open to questions and answers.
Okay, I'm not seeing any hands raised.
We stand between lunch and I guess the end of the voting.
Carrie, you had a hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question on Open RAN. I mean, obviously it's a very important and interesting development that has already a lot of momentum behind it, and in many ways I think it's going to be part of any operator's plans at some point in time in the future. But at the same time, it's just one of many ways to build a network architecture and still in somewhat early stages of development. So the recommendation on FCC to accelerate or encourage adoption of Open RAN technologies or support development of Open RAN through PlugFest and stuff like that. The question that I had was that, is that really FCC's role to pick an architecture and try to stimulate it further, or should it be left for industry to figure out, and then FCC maybe to look at associated policies and how that ecosystem evolves? So that's the sort of what I was hoping to get some more insights on that. How do you guys feel about that aspect?
So are you asking the working group or the FCC?
Working group mainly.
Yeah, so I agree the industry is solving a lot of the Open RAN. I think the viewpoint of the US government, including the FCC, has been O-RAN is a good option for US competitiveness and leadership in the RAN market and the overall 5G market. That was kind of the charter we had in the working group and what we drove forward. Yeah, and one thing I would like to correct, O-RAN is actually being deployed. It's not like some concept or idea. O-RAN's very real. And I think every vendor out there is supporting O-RAN right now, or at least working to support it. So I just want to make sure it's not, nobody walks away with the message that it's some sort of longer term implementation. So, but hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, let me just expand on that, if I could, Russ. Carrie, I don't view it as picking and choosing technologies. Certainly when you look at openness, that provides greater flexibility in architecture choices for operators. And, we see a lot of discussion within the US government on that. And as Russ mentioned, supply chain comes into that as well. So while I agree with you, steering clear of technology choices, I think openness goes beyond that and actually increases the choices potentially that are available. So that's the way I would look at it.
Thank you.
Not seeing any other hands raised, I'll go ahead and offer a question myself. And this is on the recommendation around readiness for terahertz and the uncertainty there and support research. You've also put this in as a recommendation for work to be undertaken by the next year's version of the current working group. How do you position those two, since it's an activity that's still out there, a lot of research going on in the university community, not very much beyond the university community, at least from what I have seen. But to make this more tangible, what do you see the FCC doing?
Yeah, so I think as we look at 6G and some of the technologies, a lot of the proposals do call for using terahertz sort of spectrum, or at least that's kind of a target area. And I think some of that's realistically due to, the limited amount of spectrum there's out there. I would say from an FCC perspective, it's very early days. So that's what the working group would take a deeper dive on and look at the technical merits, work with some of the universities and come back with recommendations, if any, to the FCC on that, Dennis. That's how most people think about terahertz.
Yeah, I agree with that, Russ. And the implications of requiring those higher bandwidths and moving up in frequency spectrum, I think are some of the things we need to start thinking about early, especially in the early stages of 6G.
We have a cat video happening here at the FCC, I think. We've been cat bombed. Somebody has a rogue cat.
That's quite all right. Dogs and cats and young children are definitely welcome at the TAC meeting. All right. Greg, you have your hand raised, so please go ahead.
Add something about the terahertz discussion that, in addition to the communications aspects of terahertz, it's very important that we bring in the astronomical community, because every time I've looked at it in the past, the first question that comes up is, how are you going to keep from interfering with those people trying to listen to things that nobody else can hear?
Yeah, that's a good point, Greg. Yeah, and part of why we need to start thinking about the terahertz and what the implications are as we move higher in frequency.
Yeah, there was a great conference held this summer. I think it was, in fact, Monisha, I think, was on the panel even related to terahertz, and they did bring in some of the that community to address some of the topics, and there seemed to be an openness to sharing, but I don't want to speak for them. I think that's something we would need to look into as well. But I believe Ted Rappaport hosted that, and he is also a member of the TAC. So the goal would be to leverage some of his work and expertise in that area.
Yeah. I think terahertz is still in very early days. A lot of it is still in the research phase in academic communities. Just as millimeter wave, it took a fairly long time for it to mature from the labs into actual products. So it's a good thing that we're keeping an eye on it, because these technologies creep upon us faster than we expect. And all of the issues raised here are absolutely pertinent. We have to keep those in mind, and input into the academic and the other research community as they're developing this will be obviously appreciated.
Okay, Adam, you have your hand raised. Thanks, Manisha. Adam, you're on mute.
So concurrent with our meeting, there's actually a summit on this topic that IEEE is holding. And, the best I can get out of it is that the propagation of terahertz waves is likely to be very short distances, okay, number one. Number two, the underlying electronics for that are materials which are not in large-scale production. So I think what Manisha said is, it's early days, it's a long rollout, okay? if you were to look at what terahertz waves in fact offer, it may be important for indoor uses, things of that sort, to sort of balance the bandwidth on the rest of the network, okay? Having said that, what I'm not seeing is as much attention to infrared and light, for which there is a much better infrastructure, the technology is much more mature, and it gives you the bandwidths for the same purposes. So just calling out terahertz by itself seems odd to me if you understand the underlying physics.
Interesting perspective. Is there a response on that from Brian or Russ?
I think it's easy enough to add that to the charter if it's, you know, if we get the green light to move forward with that, to explore those two as well. I mean, some of the, what's the acronym for the light communication?
Wi-Fi.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of work in that area as well, so.
Yeah, I think the key is it's early. As Adam mentioned, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on terahertz and some of that early research, but, you know, again, don't restrict it at this point because it is so early.
Yeah.
If I could add something, Dennis, what I've seen is very exciting about antenna design at terahertz. Some of it is even closer to light lens design.
It is lens design fundamentally.
Right, and you can do some really interesting things with that.
Yeah, also just want to remind you that our spectrum regulation, as defined in the ITU document as well, extends up to 3 terahertz. So there is some physical limitation that we need to consider as well. That you know, a lot of lasers and that sort of things, and I think some of the products are being you know, authorized by the FDA for the safety use rather than frequency use by the FCC.
Interesting.
And to be fair, a lot of what passes as terahertz today is not really terahertz. It's high gigahertz. Yeah, it's hundreds of gigahertz and up, and it's really in a research phase at this point.
Yep.
Yeah, and if you noticed in our recommendation, we kind of cover a broad spectrum there, no pun intended, between, you know, high millimeter wave to terahertz.
Okay. Good discussion. Any other comments or questions?
I do have one comment I was going to bring up just on potential work for 2021. You know, there's been a lot of speculation, and even the pundits are calling for, you know, some level of net neutrality being refocused in 2021 based on the new administration. So that is something the TAC looked at in the past. I'm just going to put it out there as not specifically to this working group, but an overall area that might be something that the TAC looks at.
Good idea.
Okay, Lynn, you have a comment.
Yeah, so I didn't know if you were taking questions on new items yet as far as to be included, or if you were wanting to vote on the old and then we kind of move on to the new.
Yeah, I wanted to conclude now, and you exactly hit it. I have next on the agenda is other topics, and I am looking forward to your introducing one. Adam, do you have a comment on this topic? You're on mute.
No.
Okay, very good. I guess I just hadn't pulled your hand down.
I forgot to lower the hand.
No, I've been doing that, and I just didn't get yours. Great. All right, then that puts us to the position of determining whether we adopt or not this set of actionable recommendations. All those in favor of adoption, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, same sign. Okay, we have another set of unanimously adopted actionable recommendations. That gives us a complete set. So thank you very much for all of the work that has led to this really solid set of actionable recommendations. There are a lot of them. Usually we try to limit to 3 per group. We have, as with this group, 5 and 5 for the artificial intelligence and 5 plus for the. So anyway, fortunately, some of them overlap so that the total is, and particularly the spectrum sharing, so it's not quite as large, but it is a large group of actionable recommendations. So Ron and Michael and Martin and others, you have a wealth of opportunities presented to you through the TAC body this year. With that, let me turn to Lynn and to others. If there are topics that were not represented by the working groups or late breaking ideas that occurred to you in the last 23 minutes that you'd like to provide as items for consideration for next year's TAC, this would be the time to provide them.
Okay, Dennis, thank you so much. So this is kind of something that just kind of is including as far as with some of the working groups that we have, or it could be separate, but I think it might be able to be covered as far as internal with existing working groups that we are proposing to have. But you know, we all see the fast-paced changes that that are occurring as far as with the technologies, everything happening with the standards and the manufacturers, and we also know that from discussions as far as how these frequency bands are expanding as far as for the use, and we're seeing the new entrants as far as into the marketplace, whether we consider it from the satellite or the fixed wireless spaces as far as in operations. And really what I'm suggesting is, and it could be the 5G working group, the future working group, or even the unlicensed or other areas, as far as just that we should go ahead and be asked to provide specific recommendations that dealing with technology impacts as far as for the rural areas, or what we'll call the rural less dense areas, and any other type of developments as far as part of their charter. And why I say this is I think the FCC needs to have an opportunity to go ahead and see the rural area together and yet separate as far as part of these technology changes and technologies that we're discussing. Because in many times it's just lumped in as general, and there's not an opportunity for the FCC to go ahead and separate it out. If there's any little change, what is the difference between the rural and what's the difference between a higher density area? So my suggestion would be is, as we go through with these working groups, any working group that could have something that would have a little bit of a separation between a rural and a more urban setting, to have the opportunity with that to have it included in the charter to go ahead and make recommendations as far as dealing with the rural and the urban. And when they're together, and when they're separate, they're separate. And that was really my whole thought as far as for that. And if you wanted to have a separate group, you could have a separate group, but I think you're going to be covering so many items that are the same. It might work well if it was part of the same group. And that's kind of my lead off as far as what I was kind of looking at as far as from this. So I just ask that when you do go ahead and put your charters together, consider any area that could have a definition as far as for a rural area to be included with it.
And even though Dale has his hands up, I'm going to call on Marty, because Marty, this leads right into one of your hottest of the hot buttons, which is underserved communities. So would you like to address that for a moment? And you're on mute.
Yes, only in the sense that it's no surprise to anybody that I think the issue of the digital divide is crucial. That the efforts of the FCC in the past have been directed at broadband, and there really should be broadband wireless, because broadband wireless is is becoming, partially as a result of the pandemic, there's been an acceleration of the move in that direction, but it's very clear that broadband wireless has become crucial to education. So I think it's really important that we do something in 2021 to address the digital divide with respect to wireless broadband.
Oh, very good. And I knew that this does have a linkage to Lynn, and it also afforded me the opportunity to congratulate you on your book that is now out. So you get a
It's a great relief to get it done.
Yeah, no, it's really, really super. We're very proud of you and in getting that out, and significant tome, which I've not yet read, but I'm looking forward to doing so soon. All right, Dale, thank you for waiting for that connection to Marty.
Oh, it's my honor to have waited for Marty. Yeah, and congratulations, Marty, on your book. That is absolutely wonderful. I want to make two comments. You've all heard me say before, I won't repeat it. Receiver performance interference manifests itself in receivers. If you have poorly performing receivers, you get interference. And I still think that we are not focusing enough on the receiver part of the equation. The second thing that I have been having increasing trouble with is if we're going to automate and use AI techniques, for example, to ferret out interference after systems are operating. I'm not talking about before. You got a really difficult problem of defining harmful interference. I mean, how do you automate something when you don't have an objective sort of measure of it? You can't hold a hearing. You can't call the FCC and let's have a hearing to determine who is at fault here. And so it seems very clearly to me we have to do more to come up with a clear definition of what harmful interference is after the systems are deployed. I'm not talking about the propagation modeling and stuff that you do in advance. I'm talking after it occurs. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dale. Steve Lanning, you're up next.
Yes, I wanted to go back to the discussion that that was brought up about rural. I did not include it in the white paper because it was going too far afield. But in terms of the accuracy of covered and uncovered and the broadband mapping, I did do an analysis where I used the rural urban continuum code and against the Georgia data, and I found 4% of locations in urban areas were unserved, given those urban areas have a very much larger population. The total numbers of unserved in urban areas, at least in the state of Georgia, is quite high, and easily rivals that in the rural areas. Now, unsurprisingly, and in support of what Lynn said, the proportion increased all the way up to 30% in the most rural areas that were unserved in FCC census blocks, according to 477, that had 25 megabit per second or better services. So the incidence of issues is much higher in rural areas, and so that adds some support for what Lynn is asking for. But it also the total numbers of issues and unserved people, you shouldn't be ignoring the urban areas, because quite honestly the total numbers are easily as high. But then the last bit is what should we be using as a definition of ruralness? I mean, I use this, rural urban continuum code and just did things by county type, which is already kind of a rough thing. And so there's really even some thinking to do on what that should be.
Oh, great. Thanks, Steve. All right, Madeline.
Yeah, thank you. I recall in an email that Michael Haas sent when we were getting ready for this meeting that we might be thinking about what we would do in 2021 and kind of touching on the underserved populations, whether they be rural or whether they be in our cities. I think about the effort that's being put into, better than nothing broadband, if you will, and would like to point out that the broadcast network, the television broadcast network, can optimize these sort of lower capacity broadband connections by offloading certain traffic to the broadcast network while you leave perhaps a narrower unicast network open for two-way traffic. So you think about, for example, the distance learning situation. If you have a slower line like a DSL line or some of these that are being contemplated for rural areas, wouldn't it be better for the lecture to come over a one-to-many network, leaving that smaller two-way network available for students' questions and homework and things like that? So I think it's something that the TAC might consider for 2021 is really thinking about how to optimize the nation's resource of the television band, especially given the ATSC 3.0 rollout, which is now reaching 1 in 7 households and will probably be reaching about 70% of households by this time next year. But the broadcasters are working on distance education, even with the ATSC 1.0 system. And the question is going to be, if you're going to do large data downloads like the video through the broadcast network, and you want to do smaller things through another network uplink, like homework and questions and whatnot, how can we marry that resource of the broadcast network with the resources of smaller two-way networks that are, perhaps prevalent in underserved populations? So this kind of gets to what was put into Michael's email of, check the date on that. It was on January the 11th, where we talked about heterogeneous networks and dynamic spectrum sharing. Something along those lines might be worth exploring within the TAC in 2021. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Russ, you're next.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the rural and the mapping. I'd made a couple of points earlier related to mapping that seemed to be in line with Adam's report on AI, but clearly understanding where underserved and unserved issues really are. But I think there's another piece to this that we often ignore. It's not just the demand or the supply, but it's the demand side as well. And this may not be in scope for the TAC, but understanding why some of the take rates, or why where there is supply, there is not use of some of the broadband technologies, and that may be something that's part of the equation here. And Lynn, I don't know if you have information on that or not, but it's a lot of time. We had a report a couple years ago where a lot of this comes down to economics too. So.
Okay, good. Thank you, Manisha.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I just wanted to, add to this discussion, which I think is very, very relevant, especially given the way we've all lived our lives in the last year, to point out a few things. One is, I fully agree that perhaps for the TAC, for this TAC, maybe the distinction should be underserved versus served, and the underserved could be urban, could be rural, suburban, anywhere. There has been a precision ag task force running last year, and I don't know if they're going to continue into this year, which actually delved into the connectivity and broadband needs of precision agriculture, which by definition is mostly in rural areas. And as we go forward with this group, perhaps that should be the definition of, just keep it underserved. And living in Chicago and some of the research work we've been doing with the university and local communities, there's absolutely underserved communities in urban area that are not being served. I also want to pick up on what Russ just said about the economics. the south side of Chicago is seeing fairly high rollout of millimeter wave 5G by Verizon. Who is using it? The phones cost $600. So just having infrastructure there, having the signal strength there, having availability does not mean that people in that community are actually going to pick up on it. Conversely, I've heard people living in very fancy neighborhoods who complain that they don't have any infrastructure, broadband wireless infrastructure, because they don't want cell towers and small cells in their backyards. So when we look at what being served means, the economics absolutely plays into it. And I think that is something the TAC should definitely consider. It's not just technology being available or networks being deployed, it's also how do we encourage adoption? What are the barriers to adoption in this? And a final note is there is a lot of work in this area that's happening in the NSF as well. I was on a workshop just the other day where they're talking about measurement barriers to internet research. And one of the big questions there was underserved areas. How do you measure it? How do you get it out there? So a tighter connection between all of the various efforts happening within the federal agencies would also be a great thing for the TAC to look at going forward.
Great, thank you. Nomi.
Yes, hi Dennis, hi everybody. I guess I wanted to ask, perhaps this is of the people from the FCC who are here, our honored colleagues, just for clarification on where you would like to see the TAC weigh in here versus the BDAC on the rural matters. Like where could we be helpful? I think there's been lots of conversation here today about, I think the TAC would certainly view broadband solutions as very hybrid. I remember learning about that more than 20 years ago from Dale, who said that wireless networks are really wired networks. And so we're looking at further evolutions of that, whether it be Madeline's comments about what's happening with the broadcast network and voice spaces and things like that, or Marty's great comments about what's happening with wireless and satellite. Where would you like us to weigh in that's different and apart from the BDAC? Mm-hmm.
That's probably a very good transition because time-wise, we're getting to that point, and I was going to ask Ron to provide some of his final comments and thoughts, and so you can combine your response to Nomi along with any final comments and thoughts and ideas that you'd like to share.
Sure. Thank you, Dennis, and that's a good question, Nomi. I think what I'll just say before I go into some closing remarks is that there are several areas, not just the definition of rural and urban versus served, unserved, or not served. Those sorts of questions do come up in, of course, in the BDAC setting. And it's something that I think I'll make the commitment to take back and talk to the chairs, or talk internally about how some of the synergies of what's happening in some of the other working groups could be buttressed by the technical work and scoping out the charter for the next cycle and the working groups that will be established on how the TAC could support some of these other areas that are on the agenda and perhaps an area of key focus for some of these other advisory committees that serve the commission's roles and responsibilities. Just a couple areas that come to my mind. We've got a consumer advisory committee when it talks about perhaps some of the AI, machine learning related activities. We also have the CISRIC that's under the purview of the Public Safety Bureau. So when it comes to reliability of networks, all the way from resiliency of the core to perhaps backup power that might be necessary for disaster type response. Those sorts of things I think would fall under the bailiwick of maybe some of the other advisory committees that the commission is responsible for. So long story short, I think we've got a little bit of homework to do to think through how internally we might work and leverage the work of the TAC, but also leverage the work and areas of responsibility of some of these other advisory committees. From the perspective of closing remarks, I just repeat, but not for the sake of repeating, the incredible work that this last TAC has devoted, the amount of voluntary effort that went into preparing the actionable recommendations, and more specifically on the AI working group, the white paper that was pulled together. I failed to get the microphone as it was being approved, but I wanted to let you know that the authors have editorial privilege to make grammatical fixes, typographical fixes, as well as conforming edits that are necessary to clean up the document. But if there's any questions about timeline for release and that sort of thing, please work with Michael on the specifics there. And from an overall perspective, again, I can't express enough my appreciation for everybody involved in coming up with these recommendations. I think they give us a lot to work with from a commission perspective, and certainly will be part of the briefing materials that OET will be including in briefing the new leadership of the FCC. So thank you again to all. And I will make one last silly observation, and that has to do with an award that I will deem the Cat's Meow Award. Obviously goes to the terahertz spectrum. So all the work that went into the 2020 recommendations, the terahertz work gets the Cat's Meow Award. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that. Manisha, any final comments? You've been able to contribute richly in the meeting, but any final comments for the group?
Nothing more to add to what Ron said, except this was a great year. I really enjoyed participating in all of the discussions, and I look forward to what the next, installment of the TAC looks like.
Great. Thanks, Manisha. Martin, any comments from you?
Nothing for me, thanks.
Okay. Michael, please close us out from the FCC side.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis, and thank you everyone making the time. I think this has been very informative for many of us. It's kind of repeating what we went through in December, but also it's a great refresher to realize and recognize some of the details of the recommendations. And also, I know everybody spent all of their efforts and so forth. And also, I like to show the tremendous level of efforts and support from the FCC liaisons, as well as Jeff and Steve, a few other folks here from OMR, making this online event happening and making a reality. Thank you all the staffs, and we hope to have our next TAC session. We'll kick out as planned, but then again, as Ron said, we will work internally, need to do some homeworks, and we will hope to catch up with everybody soon. With that, back to you, Dennis.
Okay, and I would like to observe in line with the cat's meow that Michael was not able to keep his tie on through the entirety of the meeting, so that was...
That's good. Dennis, it was choking me a little bit, so immediately I said, wow, my shirt got shrunk. And then I realized that I have not been to the cleaners. So I gained some weight, apparently.
Well, let me make a few final comments as well. I know we're actually a couple minutes over, which is amazing. The perspective was, gee, how are we going to use this amount of time? But we've run over. But I would like to applaud the team. These are big topics, as we've seen, and the interesting feature of the year, with all of the worries and concerns about COVID and the pandemic, I really do think this was our most productive year ever. Most attendance at the meeting, and witnessed this meeting as an example. So I really applaud all of you for your significant contributions and stick-to-itiveness and being so available through this time to work on these tremendous tasks. I want to extend that point to this meeting as well. This has been the rich conversation that has so characterized the TAC through the years, and that was absent from our December meeting. So I really am pleased that we did have this bonus meeting to be able to have some of the rich conversation and discussion that has occurred in this meeting. So kudos to all of you for contributing to that contributions. I do have some thank yous. certainly to the working group chairs, phenomenal job in providing the leadership. And I do have to single out Lisa and Adam in this case, since they had a lot of work between the last meeting and this meeting to get the white paper in place and to do all that they have done. Certainly all the working group chairs have done a phenomenal job, but in adding this extra piece, you are singled out, and particularly Lisa, I mean, our heart still goes out to you and the loss for the last year and your contributions even through that extraordinary period, but you're just really amazing. So we do appreciate you so much. I'd also like to recognize the subgroup leaders. So it's not just the working group leaders, but subgroup leaders that have been there, certainly all members of the TAC, the subject matter experts. Michael has already mentioned the liaisons, but you've done a phenomenal job in many cases, contributing a great deal to ensuring that we stayed on track and steering the ship, if you will, into the waters that are most profitable to FCC, which is what we're here for. So really thank each one of you. And then do want to recognize Ron for your sponsorship and overall guidance and leadership for us. For Manisha, you are the most active CTO we have ever had vis-a-vis the TAC, and really appreciate your ongoing contributions, including during this meeting. I've already recognized Martin for the often quiet role that he plays, but it really is an important role. And then of course Michael, who makes sure that we all come together and the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, as well as the big picture is in view. So thank you one and all. We will, as we go through the transition, we will of leadership in the 8th floor, we will see how all things materialize, and we'll look forward to hearing the inputs as those things happen. But certainly we look forward to being together and working on the TAC in the in the current year actually now. So thank you one and all.
Dennis.
Yes.
I can't let you close without a thank you from all of us for your leadership. I think this has been a banner year in terms of accomplishments and outputs from the TAC, and we owe a lot to you. Thank you very much.
Amen. You're very kind.
Here, here.
Yes.
Here. Yeah.
Here.
Agreed.
All in favor, say aye.
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 No, you're all very kind, but it really is an honor to have the opportunity to work with you. I mean, you are quite a phenomenal group of people. So it's in many dimensions, certainly technical leadership, business acumen, just good people. And I appreciate the opportunity. So thank you all so much. And with that, we will close out, and I do apologize for running over, but I not very much, because I've enjoyed it thoroughly. So have a good week, a good month, and a good year, and soon we'll get through all of this and be back to things that are a little more normal, but actually enhanced normal based on all of what you've done. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.
I know.